I think that in some ways, some of these folks think they are practicing philanthropy just by shoveling large amounts of money out to, let's say, university programs where they wind up getting their name on a building, and you can say, well, Guggenheim has their name on a building as well in New York, but that was never really the point.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching or listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, which is a podcast produced by my producer, Ernie Gregg. And my guest today is Dirk Smillie. Now, I just want to ask you before we go further, Dirk, am I saying Smiley right? Or do you say, because it's spelled sort of Smiley. A friend of mine is novelist Jane Smiley, but hers is, I think, with a Y or something. So I always knew how to say that one. But in any case, I was asking you just before we went live here on Facebook where you were, and you said your mother-in-law's house?
Actually, my godmother's place.
Your godmother's house, okay.
Yeah, in Southampton, New York.
And where do you live?
I live in New York City.
In what part of town?
I live in northern Manhattan, the very northern tip.
Like up near the cloisters kind of thing, or? Very
close to the cloisters, yeah. A little bit north of the cloisters. It's like right at the very end of Manhattan. If you go any further, you'd...
Sure, I know right where you are. Is the cloisters walkable from your place?
It is. I've done it many times.
That is a nice perk.
It's an amazing place. I don't think people realize that what I think is still the largest collection of medieval architecture in the United States.
Yeah.
And they've got a wonderful garden, cafe, and it's a great thing to do on an afternoon.
I know I've written a lot about the cloisters, and I've spent a lot of time there because Jeannie and I and my grandchildren and kids, we spent a lot of time in the city, and we would always, on the way back, we would take that last turn off before we left Manhattan and go up and sort of visit the cloisters on the way out or on the way to, because it was a nice stop and you didn't have to get off your path much. I'm always amazed because people go to the Met, and of course that ticket, or rather the quote donation, which is now no longer a donation, they won't let you in, also gives you a pass to the cloisters. But the one time I took the bus up from the Metropolitan Museum, I forget what the bus was. It goes up there. There is a bus that goes all the way up there, but it's about a 35-40 minute ride by the time you're done. So I'm always wondering who from out of town goes to the Metropolitan, figures out they can go to the cloisters, and includes it in the same day. I don't think too many people do it.
Absolutely, yeah. It's actually you can get up there pretty quickly if you know how to go. And there's also you can take Metro North out of Midtown.
Sure.
Central, you can be up northern Manhattan in 22 minutes.
Yeah.
So, but don't spread that around. Because
how long have you been up there? I mean, up at that part of Manhattan?
Gosh, Frank, I think we've lived up there around 20 years.
And who's we?
Well, my daughter, who actually is now in college, and she started, she's a freshman at Colorado College.
Yeah. And that's why you've got the Colorado sweatshirt on.
Exactly. I'm trying to show my solidarity.
A little solidarity for her. I was just reading it down there thinking there's got to be a reason for this. It doesn't show up in your book. So, yeah. So what is she going to study?
Well, they're on a very interesting system there called the block plan. And the block plan, you study one class at a time for 3.5 weeks. And then you get 5 days off, and then you move on to your next class, but you just take one class at a time. So she's studied Hinduism, Russian literature. She's got a lot on her plate because it's such a deep dive approach to education.
Sure.
There's not many colleges that use this plan, but it's like 4 hours a class a day with all the same people. And it's kind of like this deep dive approach. I'm not sure it's for everybody, but for her,
is she having fun so far? So far, so good.
Absolutely. And she, she's at the foot of the Rockies, so you've got all this amazing.
Where's it located?
Yeah, exactly.
But where's the school located?
The school is located in Colorado Springs.
Oh, it's yeah. Because I spoke at the Colorado Springs Library. I was their guest. I forget. 10 or 15 years ago, but
Mhm.
it's an interesting little town because it sort of intersects your interests as well, because having written another book, which was Falwell Incorporated, or actually the title was Falwell Inc. I guess that came out in 2008.
That's right.
So Colorado Springs, as you know, it was the whole focus on the family center and hub. And it was kind of one of these odd towns that a bunch of very conservative evangelicals moved into and almost sort of took over a big part of the town. And then at the same time, it's, not exactly a hippie commune, but it's, a lot more like Santa Monica, California, in terms of the vibe of everybody else. So the juxtaposition of an evangelical, ultra conservative Christian group in town meant that when I spoke at the library, I packed it out. I had a lot of people who had been following my work from a more progressive side, who had either come out of the focus on the family kind of thing, and now they were looking back, regretting their time in it, or lived in the town and were fascinated by this and a bit worried by this right-wing evangelical group in their midst. So it's an interesting place. I haven't been back since, and so I don't know, what's going on there now. Let me ask you, let's start with your books a little bit more in order. What in your background personally, and how you grew up and who your parents were and your interests, it's a big world out there. Why does somebody write a book called Falwell Inc? I mean, I know why I would write it, because my dad was a famous evangelist and I knew Falwell and spoke from his pulpit and have written about him from the point of view of someone who came out of that movement. Why did you write about it?
Well, I wrote about it from the standpoint of a business reporter, reporting on the rise of a kind of a mini empire that you know so well, Frank. And I had done a story for Forbes magazine. We did kind of like a 4-page spread on this huge fundraising effort that was going on at Liberty right around the time you mentioned, 2008, or a little before that. And we were trying to figure out, how is it that Jerry Falwell, who, really was in the twilight of his celebrity at that point,
right?
But 20 years earlier had been this wildly, highly visible evangelical. I mean, in that book, I remember documenting 11 separate appearances on Nightline in a single year. I mean, he was all over the place, especially as Billy Graham kind of receded from public memory. So Falwell was this highly visible evangelical, but that was 20 years earlier. So now we're like 2006, 2007, and he's raising tens of millions of dollars to get his university out of debt and to kind of rebuild the whole place. So from a business reporter standpoint, that seemed like a very interesting story. How was he doing this? So anyway, I went to Lynchburg and I met Jerry Falwell. I spent a little bit of time with him and some time with his son, Jerry Jr. and Jonathan. And he agreed to cooperate both for the story and then later on in a book length treatment on the same subject, kind of the rebuilding of, Liberty University. And, my political and religious interests do not jibe at all with someone like Jerry Falwell, but I think he felt like my story, especially after seeing the story in Forbes appear, I think he felt like, this was about the best shake he was going to get from the secular press at that time, in terms of fairness, telling it like a business story. So anyway, that led to the book being done. And, unfortunately, Falwell died just a couple of months into my working on the book, but he had given his blessing to the project. And so Jerry Jr., who I got along with very well, and Jonathan as well, they agreed to kind of continue to cooperate for the purpose of the book. And so then the book became not so much like a biography of a business, but more like the first half being a biography of the business, but then the second half being a kind of forward spin on the future of the Falwell enterprises in the form of one son who's running the church and the other who's running the university.
Yeah, and of course, since then the story did not end. It went from Forbes to the tabloids. which I would have
yeah.
predicted to you. I could have told you it was going to end this way, but yeah. So pushing back a little further, what sort of background do you come from? You know, my father's a famous evangelical, and I was his nepotistic sidekick for a while. By the way, Jerry Falwell Jr. lent me his jet for quite a stretch of time. This must have been the late 70s or very early 80s. So, you know, and I spoke twice from his pulpit and once to a convocation of the school. You know, now I would be completely persona non grata, but in those days there was a lot of traffic between us and them. But I'm intrigued by your own background. You know, for me, I would describe myself as the sort of former nepotistic sidekick to an evangelical leader who left this sort of branch of evangelical royalty, as the New York Times once called our family, and went off and did a very different thing and had a career as a novelist and in the movie business and so forth, a very secular kind of progressive activist now, I guess you'd say. So it's a kind of, there's an arc to it. What's your personal arc and journey, that turns you into a writer of these two very substantial books? I have not read the Falwell book, but I am in the midst of the book we're going to be talking about here, which is this, and Guggenheim. And we'll get into it in a minute, but just talk to me, your journey as a writer, as a human. You have a daughter. Where did she come from? You have interests in a wide range of subjects. You're a business writer, but I'm reading your book here. I'm in the section right now on the formation of the Guggenheim Museum with Frank Lloyd Wright. It's very interesting and well done. And so that's a big range of stuff. You know, how do you get that? Where do you come from? Why all this? And, you know, who are you?
Yeah. Well,
I don't mean the business stuff. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, when I was growing up as a kid in New York City, I went to Catholic school, and my parents are both actors. And when I was about 8 years old, the family moved to LA, partly for, you know, professional reasons. And I think at that point, I kind of disconnected from my Catholicism. I went to public schools after that, good public schools, but you know, non-religious. And you know, my interest in Falwell really didn't have any kind of sort of
there wasn't a religious connection. Speaking of which, what were your parents? What kind of acting were they on? Broadway before, and then they went into the movie business. What were they doing?
Well, my dad passed away about 10 years ago, but he was a character actor for most of his career. My mother is living in LA right now. She is well into her 90s, and she is working quite a bit, actually. So she's still getting a lot of roles. And
we're talking movies or TV?
Mostly, you know, independent films, some movies. She does commercials. She actually does a lot of music videos. And she'll call me up and she'll say, "Who the heck is Lil Wayne?" You know.
That's great. I love it.
So we have a lot of funny conversations along those lines. But I'm grateful that she's still working. She's still in the business. And
isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
What part of town does she live in LA?
She lives in West LA.
Yeah,
okay. So she's on the west side and has lived there since the 60s.
Amazing. So, same house?
The same house. Yeah.
Fabulous.
Yeah, amazing. 1969.
Wow. Same house, and she's still working, and she's in her 90s. This is quite a lady you've got here.
Yeah, I'll say. Yeah, you can't hold her down. She always says that she thinks that she has an edge over the competition because there are not that many people who are age who can remember their lines. You know,
that's great. I love it.
Yeah, so she can remember her lines.
Well, that's good. I'll have to, you know, I'll be following your books. Let's see. I'm not going to take a snap judgment of how old you are, but you know, you've got another 20 books in you at this rate if you follow your mom.
I'm just trying to keep up with you, Frank. You're
okay. Well, that's different.
You're quite prodigious yourself. So
but in any case, so yeah, that's an interesting little window in the background. Did you hang out with them when they were doing their actor stuff? Did you get on some movie sets? How old were you while they were doing the New York thing?
I did a bunch of commercials when I was younger.
Sort of child actor stuff?
I started to become a child actor, but I don't know. I just really didn't, there wasn't any fire in the belly. I didn't really feel like it was a fun thing to do. I remember doing a Band-Aid commercial where I'd have to run down some sidewalk in New Jersey where they were shooting it. And then I would fall down and pretend to skin my knee. And then pretty soon my knee really was skinned and I really needed Band-Aids. And I don't know, it just, it never really caught fire in me. But writing did. I really loved writing. And I was a wire service reporter in San Francisco before I moved back east. And I wound up getting a kind of a public policy fellowship in New York. That's what brought me back. And I covered media for the Christian Science Monitor for a couple of years.
So were you in and out of Boston a little bit, where I'm living? I mean, just north of the city?
Yeah, I know you're close to the Monitor headquarters.
Oh yeah, I've been down there. In fact, when Terry Gross interviewed me for her program, Fresh Air, once on my memoir, Crazy for God, I had no idea. I thought we'd be going to an NPR studio at WGBH or something. And no, we're in a little cupboard. Wouldn't you know it? The Monitor has some studio there in that, whatever you call that whole area down there. So it was hard to find. It was down a little tiny hallway, and I went up, and I had no idea that Terry doesn't actually sit across from you anywhere, and it's not a regular connection. So I was sort of in a cupboard talking to her, but it was at the Monitor. What's that thing they've got there? That crazy room with the globe. Is that them, or is that somebody else?
Oh, maybe thinking of the Daily News. The Daily News.
Yeah.
Well, it was in the lobby.
That's right.
Yeah. I really. Listen, the Christian Science Monitor had racked up something like 7 Pulitzers. I think.
Well, it's crazy, respectable. Back in the day, and I've totally lost track of it. But who would think? But comes the day, you get a good mention in the Monitor. It was as respectable as the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. It was a thing.
No, that's really true. I mean, it was widely read in the offices of places like the State Department.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
so. How did you land a job at the Monitor?
Well, I was really just freelancing for them. So they had a permanent person that was based in New York, but I covered a lot of the media stories for them. And I think over time, I liked what they did, and they liked my style. So it was a good relationship. But, as you probably know, you're really not going to advance up in the ranks at a place like the Christian Science Monitor unless you're a Christian Scientist.
I know. I was going to ask that.
Yeah. So it had a sort of a glass ceiling there.
Sure.
But, I did one story about a correspondent named Roberta Baskin who was treated very badly at CBS for doing this whistleblower complaint. That story then got turned into a larger piece that I did for The Nation. Yeah. And the Nation version of that story actually wound up landing me my job at Forbes. So
and when would have that been? When did the Nation story get published? And then did the Forbes come to you, or did you go to them?
I went to them.
Saying you wanted to do what sort of reporting?
Well, I was really just looking for just a business writer's position, and they were hiring at the time. The tech bubble was kind of like fully inflated. This would have been around 1999, 2000. So they were doing a lot of hiring, and then of course the tech bubble burst about 6 months later, and then they started doing a lot of firing. And luckily, I wasn't on the firing side of the business, but anyway, no, it's a good time to be at Forbes because it was still a kind of a small family business with a big brand. And the guy who was editing Forbes, I don't know if you remember him, Jim Michaels. Jim Michaels was the editor there for 37 years. He was the guy who broke the story of Mahatma Gandhi's assassination.
Right.
And so he did a lot of great work for Forbes, and he kind of turned it into the cash cow that it became. And so he was on his way out at the time. So I got to do a couple of stories with him. And then I stayed another 10 years at Forbes doing business stories.
And then did that overlap any of the books you published?
Yeah, the Falwell book was
it's 2008, so I'm just trying to put the dates together.
That's right. Yeah, so by the year 2007, I took a 1-year leave of absence to do the Falwell book, which is
but you had already done the piece for Forbes, and so sort of it came out of that.
Exactly.
And that was your calling card when you went down to Jerry Jr. and whoever Falwell put you in touch with. Was Cal Thomas still hanging around the Falwell outfit at that time, or was he already gone?
I think he was already gone, but I know that name well. Yeah.
Well, he went to Fox. You know, he was the president of the Moral Majority. He didn't found it. Obviously, it was Falwell's deal, but he ran it for him. And I got to know Cal very well. And then years later, he went to Fox, and of course, then was horrified when I went in the direction I did. But then he wrote a book, sort of denouncing, not so much denouncing Falwell, but the whole kind of politicizing of the evangelical movement with Dobson and all the others. About what was the title? I've got it on a shelf somewhere. Something about the seduction of power, or something like that, saying, you know, we're losing our Christian call here. We're all trying to be too powerful. But Cal was an interesting guy, but one of these people who kind of knew that there was a shady side to the Falwell empire, in the sense that a lot of the fundraising techniques and so forth and so on that he would tell me about privately, you know, would be things he would be horrified by. But it gave me an insight into the inside of the machine. And I remember one story, I don't know if it's in your book. I'm sure it isn't, because that's not the angle of your book. But at one point, when Falwell was transitioning to a bigger footprint, he had a radio tower that somebody snapped the guy wires to, one of those old radio towers that goes up, really the big tall ones that, you know, they got to put a thing on the top for airplanes and stuff. So Cal was telling me how he raised the money 3 times over to rebuild it, once from the insurance company, once from a special fundraising deal for the tower after the insurance company had paid for it, and once from a special thing he did as part of a larger fundraising technique, where he would have, in the very, very beginning of not supercomputers, you know, back in the days when BMW would IBM would fill a room with a computer, you know, and the cards and all that. They got in, some fundraisers got in. I don't know if it was Paul Weyrich or who the mass mailer fundraiser was, but somebody helped him figure out how to use the computer to match obituaries with donors. So he could write a personal letter to widows and widowers saying, you know, your dear husband, Frank, has just passed away. And I know, you know, he helped us so much during his life, and it would really be on his heart now to help us and remember us at this time. And we just want to thank you for all these years of support, and hope that, you know, in other words, moving in on a grieving widow and trying to get a last check out of her, and how, and then of course, Cal was disgusted with this, but he never left because of it. He just sort of hung there.
Yeah, that is fascinating. In fact, just the other night, I was talking to someone who had had a long career in fundraising in the arts, and we were talking about this Falwell book, and he said, you realize that, like, everybody in fundraising in the nonprofit world, like, took their cues from what the evangelicals were doing in the 70s and 80s.
Sure.
Different type of fundraising tactics that you're talking about.
We were very good at it.
You were very good at it.
Very good at it.
Yeah.
The other thing we were very good at that has a big impact now, in the same way of people taking cues, you know, there would be no Fox News, there would be no alternative media bubble. Even what's happening with Facebook, there would be nothing of this in terms of, you know, the algorithms that point you all in one direction. We evangelicals invented that, in the sense that we had our own publishing companies, we had our own TV programs, we had our own TV stations, we had our own networks, we had our own radio stars. You know, it was the Dobsons and the Falwells that opened the door for right-wing talk radio. Right-wing talk radio opens the door for Fox, but none of it happens unless the evangelicals had created this alternative universe and gotten a whole group of Americans used to believing everything else was fake news, and you had to go to your own source. And the evangelicals perfected that, so that criticisms would roll off them like water off a duck's back, because it was just persecution. You know, this story about me sleeping with my secretary, or stealing the money, or, you know, whatever, fill in the blank. Unless it was incontrovertible, they would pitch it as well, just more criticism from the liberals and the secular humanists and so on. It was you know, and of course, the ultimate of that is Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And of course, he was advised by the evangelical leaders that I grew up with, or that actually got into what they did, like Franklin Graham and Jerry Falwell Jr. These other people, all of whom I knew well, at one point or another, were advising him directly on how to do this, how to play the game.
Frank, how do you account for their embrace of someone like Donald Trump?
Because, the thing is, they didn't see Trump. They didn't care that Trump was this immoral man, because I just put it this way. It's hard for somebody outside of the evangelical environment to understand something. Once evangelicals can be convinced that something is of the Lord, in other words, this is God's hand in history, then it doesn't matter whether it's Hitler, who was used by God, according to some evangelicals, to augment the immigration to Israel so it could become a state again in 1948, which then sets the stage for the return of Christ and fulfills prophecy. So all of a sudden, it isn't that you like Hitler, but that you just see how it's all part of the big plan. Well, the trick that Ralph Reed and these other guys pulled, especially Franklin Graham, was to begin to pitch Trump, because of his agreement to only put judges from the list of the Federalist Society on the courts and so forth, as an instrument of the Lord. And so then they have all sorts of biblical precedent. King David's murdering somebody so he can sleep with his wife. King Darius, Sirius, all these people in the Bible who are used by the Lord. Doesn't matter whether they're evil or good. So essentially what secular writers did not understand, coming at it from the politics as normal side, was that the trick wasn't to get them to vote for a guy who had been married 3 times, was an adulterer and molested women, and somehow overlook it. Yeah. That didn't even have to be answered. The trick was to get them to understand that they were electing somebody who was bad as a human being, but who had been chosen for this moment, for such a time as this, by the Lord, to do some specific things, appoint these judges, defend religious civil liberty in a way that you see, for instance, in the Amy Coney Barrett court now, where evangelical groups got judges appointed who believe that somehow church services are exempt from public health policy. Everybody else, has to not meet, but you can't do this to churches because they're special. It's religious liberty. That's it, period.
So then whether or not
that jump was made, you can do anything.
Yeah. And then whether or not you embrace that becomes basically a test of faith.
Well, and you notice that the only constituency he delivered to 100% was evangelical Zionists who wanted the embassy moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That wasn't for the Jewish lobby. That was for the evangelical lobby. That was on the list.
Yeah.
Justices to the Supreme Court, hundreds of federal judges, bashing gays, bashing trans people in the military.
Yeah.
Everything was on the checklist of the vision they have for a sort of a theocratic America. And as long as he kept fulfilling that, he never lost support, and he still hasn't lost it. 70% of them believe he's still president.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's sad but true. I'm kind of fascinated at the what I think is a kind of a newfound fascination with a lot of these evangelical figures. I mean, the movie about Tammy Faye that came out recently was a wild success. There's at least 2 different series that's being done now on the Falwells. There was one by Andrew Jenks. The guy had his series on MTV for a while. So that, I think he did either a 7 or an 8-part series on the Falwell legacy. So there's another production crew that's down in Miami right now who's doing something, I think, for Netflix on the Falwell legacy.
Yeah.
So,
there's a thing they're doing, somebody doing one called Pool Boy, or maybe it's already out. I don't know. I mean, that's the name of one of the projects. Yeah. But the point being, back in the day when I wrote my memoir, Crazy for God, which was 15 years ago or something or longer, I thought, okay, I'm bookending something here. Hillary Clinton will be president someday. This is past history. People who knew my family will be interested. I hope it's a good piece of literary nonfiction. And I think it was, but it's like, this is then, now is something else. The exact opposite happened because, of course, everything turned upside down, and then everybody realized, look, you can take Vladimir Putin out of the picture, you can take anything you want out of the picture, any conspiratorial theory, but if you take away the white Christian nationalist evangelical voter, Trump is not even within sniffing distance of the White House. They put him in the White House. And so all of a sudden it's like, well, who the hell are these people? And then I'm getting all these calls from, as this thing starts percolating, from, Rachel Maddow and Joy Reid and others, and basically, same question you just asked me, you know, can you explain this to us? And then, you know, all of a sudden I'm talking about my book to a whole group of people who basically feel like it's ripped from the headlines, because now they're interested in how did this happen? And of course, that's not what my book's about. It's about my own journey within that world. But
yeah. Well, and also, I think, Frank, it's true that if you just looking at it from a political standpoint, particularly with the midterms coming up and then the national political races, you know, in the future, I get a little uncomfortable when I keep hearing this term Trump voter, because there's a lot of folks who did vote for Trump, but who voted for Obama in the prior election. So it may be true, and I totally take your point about, you know, the evangelical vote being pretty much solidified. It would be very hard to break that apart. But all the other pieces of the electoral pie, I think, you know, are in play. So someone who voted for Obama 1 year and then voted for Trump 4 years later will certainly not vote for whoever the Trump candidate is, or if it's Trump himself. You know, so those are not a lock.
Yeah, and the thing is, though, the percentage-wise, of course, with 82 or 83% of 60 million evangelicals or whatever it is voting for Trump, I mean, they're his biggest block, and they're the one that's, you know, gave the most muscle to all those people who kept meeting with him in the White House. You know, having been one of those people, and my dad being one of those people, and an other set of Republican presidencies, you know, access to the White House and so forth. But even, you know, back in our heyday, even Jerry Falwell wasn't walking in and out of the White House as much as, say, a Ralph Reed did. I mean, they were actually, you know, writing legislation, especially in terms of appointing judges. They had total veto power over. I mean, nobody was appointed to the federal court that Franklin Graham and these guys hadn't signed off on. Nobody.
Yeah. Well, then there's
that's kind of unprecedented.
Yeah, and then there's the famous example of Ronald Reagan coming up with Sandra Day O'Connor as his nominee, but then calling Jerry Falwell to say, you know, just want to make sure you're with me on this, because if you're not, it's going to be a tough road ahead.
Well, the jet that Jerry lent Dad and me, story has it, was given him. It's an Israeli-made jet that was given him as a gift by the grateful people of Israel via Menachem Begin, who wanted to thank him for running interference with them, with Ronald Reagan, who I think, if I've got the plane right, didn't want to sell them F-15s at some point. If it was the F-15 or 16, anyway, whatever our most advanced fighter jet was, and or would sell it to them without the most advanced equipment, whatever the deal was. And Falwell was one of the people who was in tight enough with Ronald Reagan in terms of voting a voter bloc, that the fact that he went to the White House and told Ronald Reagan that really this would warm the hearts of his evangelical voters because we love Israel, because it's fulfilling prophecy. He spun that whole thing to Reagan in person, and Begin thanked him with their equivalent of a Learjet. I used to know the name of the jet, but and we flew around in it after that.
That's the only way to fly.
Yeah, it's the only way. My first and last trip in a private jet. Okay, so look, this is great. I just want to ask you about this book here. And this is Frank Schaeffer. We are talking today on In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer with a friend Dirk Smillie, who has written on Falwell. We've been talking about that, but his new book. When did this book come out, by the way?
That came out just a few months ago. So
yeah, because it's sort of new. I think I got it from I don't know whether I bought this one or got it from the publisher, but The Business of Tomorrow, The Visionary Life of Harry Guggenheim, From Aviation and Rocketry to the Creation of an Art Dynasty. So my first exposure to the Guggenheims was actually, I think, in 1958, in a wheelchair at the Guggenheim on the top floor, looking at this. I just had an operation on my polio leg at the Pittsburgh Children's Hospital. I was 6 years old, and there was this incredible spiraling runway that using the brakes judiciously, I could ride from the top of the museum to the bottom. So I was kind of there. And I think, what was the 1952 date? Is that when they broke ground? I've just been reading your book about it.
I think that's correct. Yeah, I think that's when they officially broke ground on the actual.
Yeah, because I was born in 52 and I had my operation when I was 6. So let's see, 52, 58. So I'm just trying to make sure that I've got my dates right.
Yeah.
It's in here somewhere when they cut the ribbon and opened it, but it was.
Yeah. Well, the Guggenheim actually opened in 1959.
Yeah. Okay. So then that's it, because it was new, and I was there in my wheelchair with a cast that I'd had on for 3 months. So I remember that. So anyway, and then of course later in Venice, they had I forget when did they establish the Guggenheim in Venice?
Well, that came a few years later, because that was the
that was Peggy,
villa
right?
of Peggy Guggenheim. Exactly.
Yeah, and what was her? I'm sure it's in the book here, but I get the one thing that, terminal dyslexic here. I can't keep everybody straight. That's not your fault; it's mine. But what was Peggy's relationship to Harry?
Well, Peggy was Harry's cousin.
Okay, because that's what I couldn't keep straight.
Yeah,
and how come Peggy got such a big say in the museum part and becomes this grande dame of salons and art and all the rest of it? How does that happen?
Well, Frank, for a lot of years, Peggy was the kind of the black sheep of the family,
right?
And she was a pretty big force in the art world in her own right.
Well, I know. And I saw her in Venice. I didn't meet her, but she was actually still. Yeah. We were there. I forget. Do you know what year the Guggenheim in Venice opened?
Well, the Guggenheim New York took over the operation of the Venice site some years after Harry died. I think it might have been around 76 or 1977.
Because I remember being in Venice and knowing that Peggy Guggenheim had a villa there. It was, I think, if I remember, we went by at one time, and my dad, who knew all about the Guggenheims, and the wealthy movers and shakers, pointed it out as Peggy's place. And then later, it was I'm confused here, but I was looking at it from the water much later, and it was like then it had become part of the museum in New York.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, after she died, she essentially willed the museum and the whole collection to the New York Museum, sort of keep it in the family. But Harry was kind of one of the early people that started to broker that deal.
Right.
So he started to lay the groundwork for that. And then, some years later, after he died in 1971, the museum then kind of finalized the whole arrangement with Peggy and the foundation.
And forgive me for being so ignorant about this, but how did Harry overlap with things like the Morgan, the Neue Gallery, the Frick, and the Hammer, these kind of incredible museums and collections that came out of people with a similar, I wouldn't say similar path to his, but similar, industrial giants. Was there ever an overlap? Was he inspired by something? Compare, my producer Ernie was saying, ask you, and this is a really good question. He said, just make sure you ask about, Dirk to kind of think and riff a little bit on the difference between people like Harry and Frick and Morgan and the footprint they had in sort of these massive, well, for that matter, we talked about the cloisters, which is, of course, the Rockefellers brought it over piece by piece from little collections all over France. So what is it about him? What is it about the Guggenheims that have them leaving this incredible museum? And these are billionaires today are building their own fleets of rockets and 214-foot yachts instead. What's happened, and how do you see him in terms of his legacy versus our, rubber barons today, as it were?
Yeah, well, he was very much an institution builder, but in some ways, he was kind of an accidental creator of the Guggenheim, because the Guggenheim Museum was based on the collection of his uncle Solomon,
right?
And Solomon had been directed by a woman named Hilla Rebay, who knew all the European artists in the non-objective movement. Yes. And so much of his collection was basically non-objective art.
Which was like Kandinsky and everybody.
Exactly. So at a certain point, Solomon had over 1,000 pieces, and they were housed in a temporary building, but they had employed Frank Lloyd Wright to start working on a permanent, building for the collection.
Yeah.
The problem is that Solomon died 10 years before the museum even opened. And after his death, Harry took over as the chair of the board and as the guy who would be overseeing construction of the museum. But there were some serious problems at the very beginning because Hilla Rebay and her collection was something very narrow in its focus in terms of the consideration of the larger art establishment at the time, in New York and elsewhere. And at one point, the New York Times actually suggested that maybe the collection should be turned over to someone, like the Frick or the Whitney or the Met.
Well, in reading that thing in your book, what interested me is at times is so typical. I have a pretty dim view of the institution in some ways. First of all, they blast him, but then since he pays them the courtesy of meeting personally with them and kissing up a little bit, then all of a sudden everything's sweetness and light. You have to play their game. I mean, isn't it crazy how the New York Times stands, makes or breaks not just theater reviews, but here we have Guggenheim having to answer to them. Yeah,
I mean, they were an incredible power base at that time, an incredible influencer on the art world. So that was extraordinary, and I think it really, really hit the alarm bells for the Guggenheim family at the time, because to have an institution like the Times essentially telling you that you're too incompetent to manage your own art collection, and being in a position to do that because it was a nonprofit registered foundation. So they had some obligations to the public interest that went beyond just doing things the way they wanted to. But I mean, in the end, Harry got rid of Hilla Rebay. He did, sort of have to make amends with the Times, as you said. But I think in the end, it worked well for the Guggenheim because the whole mandate of the collection broadened, and it became a museum that embraced a lot of different types of art beyond the non-objective world. And, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the last time I went in the Guggenheim. They did a big renovation about, 10 years ago or less. I just remember walking down from the Neue past the Guggenheim on the way to the Met, and it was either, did they shut it? They did a whole thing because actually it wasn't very well made in the sense of the architecture is great, but the building is, I don't know what the structural problem was, but it cracked. Yeah,
it's Frank Lloyd Wright was able to make decisions on virtually everything regarding that building, and that was that was a lot of the friction that Harry had to manage, because he had Sweeney, who was the second director of the museum. And so the two of them were sort of at loggerheads a lot of the time, because Frank Lloyd Wright, was used to being able to have the last word on everything. But Sweeney was the director of the museum. So that was a problem that ultimately was resolved when Frank Lloyd Wright died, 6 months before the museum opened. So he was out of the picture at that time. But probably when it comes to structural engineering and some of the things that would be done perhaps on a longer term basis, Guggenheim, I don't know if you can blame Frank Lloyd Wright for any of that, but it just may be just a natural attrition of a building that was opened, now 60 years ago. So
about a little younger than me, and I'm showing cracks too. So,
well, you can fix those.
I grew up with the building. So, anyways, I can remember going there at different ages. I found that very interesting in the book. But we didn't get to your book here. Business of Tomorrow. Okay, well, now we've got the Business of Tomorrow in Facebook and Twitter and all these other things. How do you see the relationship between the world of business that Harry Guggenheim cracks into and is so monstrously successful? And I didn't mean monstrous in this bad sense, but just successful. I want you to draw a couple parallels for me. One from my producer, Ernie, another good question between the sort of relationship to the public and power between him, say, and Jerry Falwell, since you've written on both, two men that cut a big figure. and left behind huge institutions, by the way, the art on one side and this 70,000, this campus on the other. How do you see, these are two big American figures with some bits by their lives that could be seen as a bit dubious, perhaps. And then, of course, there's you're talking about, you use these words, the business of tomorrow. Well, how does anything he did presage what's going on with what we now regard as the big businesses like Amazon and all the rest of these have these huge footprints, even bigger than anything he did?
Yeah,
as someone who's written about business, how do you see all that?
Yeah. Well, I guess one answer, Frank, is that he came out from, I mean, Harry grew up in a kind of a different tradition in terms of how inherited wealth should be spent. I think, he I think he felt the weight of the family legacy resting on his shoulders after his father died in 1930. But at the same time, the family fortune had shrunk quite a bit after the Depression because, a lot of the family wealth was tied up in Guggenheim mining stocks. So he, at that point, I mean, he in some ways was kind of like the torch between the old order and the new. He became known more for spending money in terms of, I sort of call it tactical philanthropy or social impact investing. But he became known more for spending the family fortune than really making it. Although during his many decades running the family, he added probably tens of millions of value to the family fortune. But I think he felt an obligation that inherited wealth comes with responsibilities. And so he cared a lot about the museum, which we've been talking about, but also earlier, he put a lot of money into aviation at a time when most people had never even seen an airplane.
Sure, and then he winds up as a close personal friend of Lindbergh's.
That's right. And, Lindbergh is an interesting sort of, it's almost like they shared a kind of an inverse relationship to power in a way. What I mean by that is Harry was a very rich man, but he didn't really care that much about being famous, whereas Lindbergh was wildly famous, but didn't really care that much about amassing riches. I mean, he had numerous opportunities to make a fortune, and he turned many or most of them down. So I think they had some respect for each other in some sense, in terms of like knowing that either of them could have expanded their own power. And
when Harry, did I get it right that Harry was in the Air Force at one point?
That's true. He was actually a pilot in World War I and World War II.
Yeah, because I was trying to figure the dates out again. Forgive my bad math here, but I was thinking, wasn't he too old to fly in World War II? I mean, wasn't he, or do I have that wrong?
Well, today, I don't think there's a chance in hell he would be accepted as a pilot. The Air Force cuts off pilot recruitment, I think, like in your 20s or 30s. Yes,
that's right. So, it would be a different era, but did he see action?
He saw limited action in World War II. He was stationed out on a baby flat top in the Pacific Theater, and so he did some he did some missions over the Sakashima Islands. I don't think there was a huge amount of danger involved at that point because.
But nevertheless, he didn't sign up in some. He wasn't going around doing talks to the. I mean, he could have been in danger. It was actual real service.
Yeah, he was. I mean, for 2 years, he was a commandant at Mercer Field in New Jersey, and that was basically a place where the plane manufacturers were sending the Avenger bombers for flight checks and quality control. So Harry was basically running that operation for about 2 years, and then near the end of the war, I think he wanted just to be closer to the action and also to kind of see these Avengers. In action,
how they were operating. I remember that the people flying those back and forth between the factories, the B-19 and also the Avenger, were there. That was the only time women got to fly because they weren't put in combat, but they were allowed to ferry them back and forth. And then after the war, of course, none of them could get jobs as pilots. I mean, one of those crazy little things. I have a question for you that I really want to spend some time on because of your overview of business. My producer was saying, let's talk about why we don't have tactical philanthropy now that makes this huge social impact. And then, the other thing is it ties into him being a friend of Lindbergh's. And I wonder how he liked Lindbergh's support for Hitler and fascists at one point. So, but that's a footnote. But the big story is, I think, why was he a tactical philanthropist and people like Jeff Bezos are not? They seem to have no vision of culture beyond simply making their money. And I don't mean culture like have to build museums, but they don't influence anything except they like Star Trek, so they're building spaceships. I mean, it's sophomore to the point of tears, I think. Question one, tactical philanthropy, what happened? Why aren't the philanthropists? You're still in the world of writing about business. You know these institutions. Something big has changed in that regard, I think. And why don't we have any today? What is with these guys? And is a clue to that the fact that it would be tough to picture Jeff Bezos or Musk or Zuckerberg volunteering for wartime service. I mean, my son was a Marine and fought in Afghanistan. I don't think he ever met Jeff Bezos out there, and I'm being sarcastic on purpose.
Yeah.
I mean, in the old days, some of the Hollywood stars put on the uniform and went off and served their country.
Yeah.
They don't do that now, and nor do the billionaires, and we don't have tactical philanthropists. So what's happened? I mean, what's your view of that as an American citizen and just of our culture?
Yeah. Well, I think that in some ways, some of these folks think they are practicing philanthropy just by shoveling large amounts of money out to, let's say, university programs where they wind up getting their name on a building, and you can say, well, Guggenheim has their name on a building as well in New York, but that was never really the point. That was kind of like a function of what happened rather than the direction that they took in the first place. So I don't know, I think you're pinpointing a very important kind of cultural shift among the wealthy class. Then you have folks who are putting a lot of money into programs without much oversight. That was another kind of difference between how Harry did it, and I think how today's wealthy people commit money. Harry had a philosophy about if some of the giver doesn't go with the gift, then you're sort of operating like an absentee landlord, and you should really have some deep interest or passion in the programs or the whatever it is that you're contributing to. So that ethos seems a little bit lost today. I don't know, it's hard to tell too whether there's a lot of philanthropy going on that just doesn't get reported.
Well, and of course you talked about inherited money, and these guys are all self-made. Bezos didn't come from wealth.
That's right.
So basically you'd have to look, and if you look at his wife who divorced him, she's the one who quote unquote inherited the money. She walks away with billions. Yeah. And she actually is giving away huge chunks of it and is much more of a philanthropist than he is. I mean, according to what I've read anyway. But I like your point. Yeah. What about on the side of service? I mean, why is it so unthinkable today that the super wealthy who would be still at an age when they could say volunteer for something, or their children would be in the Marine Corps with my son at boot camp in Paris Island, getting ready to go to war? I mean, why is that so unthinkable that we think of that class of people serving when only 2 generations ago it was normal? You look at all the biggest stars in Hollywood, they took time out to go serve.
Yeah,
so
I mean, right. I mean, it seems like 40, 50 years ago, there was a little more of a coherent kind of generalized agreement that to serve was just a rock-ribbed foundational value of being an American citizen. And today, I don't know, that seems to have been eroded somewhat, and maybe part of, maybe media is part of that. I don't know, in terms of how these things are portrayed. But also, after you have something like the war in Iraq, which was such a disaster and such a really kind of a shameful chapter in the country's history. I think it tarnishes institutions like the military.
Yes.
It calls into question motivations and credibility, truthfulness, and all those things that we normally, in past days all kind of took for granted, or at least some people, many people.
Yeah, I mean, my son volunteered for Marine Corps as a lark out of high school in 1999, long before 9/11. And then, of course, when it happens, it's all serious. And he was in Afghanistan for a couple of tours and once in Iraq. And, both of them did not work out well, to put it mildly. But it was interesting because you got to know, he was an anomaly at boot camp because his dad was a writer living on the Northeast, north of Boston, and what I call the sort of Volvo driving education, higher education worshiping part of America. And all his buddies were from West Virginia or Hispanics learning to speak English in boot camp. It was like there's two Americas out there. So I've become very aware of that. The other thing is that present day Harry Guggenheims, their rocket ships are not only fantasies, these are the guys who also want to live forever and upload their brains to computers. This is the same group of science fi fans who think that, eventually they'd like to colonize Mars and so on. I don't know. Did you see the movie Don't Look Up?
Yes, I did.
Okay, well, I thought it was a good film. And one thing that I thought they got right was the zillionaire techie who basically, somebody says, you're a businessman. He says, don't call me a businessman. Basically said, I'm evolution. I'm the step to the next thing. I don't think Harry Guggenheim saw himself as evolution, did he?
No, I don't think he ever had that kind of a grandiose concept of himself. I think he was well aware of the power of wealth in his age, but he also felt like, he's the guy running the family, and there's a lot of scrutiny on this family, and everything you say is parsed by reporters. So, you better get it right. And luckily, in his case, he put a lot of intelligence and a lot of research into his philanthropy. That's probably something that's missing today. Do these folks actually commit any kind of real science or research, or think through exactly what is this gift going to mean 10 years from now or 20 years from now? Is it really institution building, or is it philanthropies typically don't like to fund operating budgets, right? Because they just they don't build anything, they don't really go anywhere. I think Harry thought a few steps beyond that, which was which says a lot about his.
In talking with you, this is, by the way, Dirk Smillie, who's the author of this really wonderfully written book that's so interesting. It's like a mini American history, unintentionally, but Lindbergh, the Guggenheim Museum, art, Kandinsky, there's a lot in here. The Business of Tomorrow, the visionary life of Harry Guggenheim, from aviation and rocketry to the creation of an art dynasty. I'm going to ask you about something very briefly, but Lindbergh, so Lindbergh's supporting Hitler at one point, very pro-isolationist and or pro-fascist, I'm not going to say which, but did Harry get into that? Was he, how did that jive with him? How did he see the rise of fascism, and his buddy Lindbergh, who thought we should just leave well enough alone?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Frank. It's, I guess you have to start out to understand this relationship, to start out thinking about how much they shared. They're both Republicans, both very kind of cerebral by nature, but more importantly, they shared this passion for aviation and kind of helping to doing things that they could to lift aviation off the ground in this country. So they were, I think they were essentially best friends for many years, and I think that in the lead up to the war, there was a lot of people coming to Harry, sort of repeating Lindbergh's addresses, snippets of comments that he had made, anti-Semitic remarks. And, Harry was very resistant to the idea that Lindbergh was anti-Semitic because he knew him on this one-to-one basis so well. They spent a lot of time fishing, hunting, vacationing together, working on aviation fun projects. So,
and Harry was kind of an outdoorsman. One of the earlier pictures of him in the book is him sitting there with a shotgun in the woods as a quite young man,
That's right. So they had all this personal interest that they shared. So it was a solid, friendship. And also there was a lot writing on that friendship in terms of, sort of the profile of the Guggenheim family and Lindbergh's future.
Right.
But there were, I don't know if you want to call this a blank spot or what, but I don't think Harry ever really believed that Lindbergh was anti-Semitic per se. I think he felt like when Lindbergh was attacking Jews, it was a subset of Jews. It was not, Judaism. It was not Jewish people at large, writ large. So, and I talked to Reeve Lindbergh, Lindbergh's youngest daughter.
Yeah.
And she would say, my dad had a kind of a tin ear in some respects. He did not understand or realize the impact of what his words had on people. But, at the end of the day, the record is there and you can see what he said and under what circumstances. And somehow it did not destroy Harry and Lindbergh's relationship, but it certainly affected it to some degree because the correspondence kind of dried up to
at that point.
Yeah.
Have you thought about, we've spent a good chunk of this hour talking about this, these concepts of philanthropy and obligation of inherited money and the difference between today's, titans and yesterdays and all this stuff. Have you thought of writing a book? Because it would seem to me you'd be the guy to do it, making any kind of a comparison or unpacking the change in the philanthropic kind of work and attitudes of today's zillionaires and yesterday's people like Morgan and Guggenheims, the Rockefellers, and so forth, because it just seems to me that there's a real story there, not necessarily to find fault with today's billionaires, but something's really changed in America in so many ways, and this is one of them.
That's a very powerful idea, Frank. I think it's definitely worth looking into, and certainly it would be the kind of thing you would have to tackle at a book length project, I would think.
Sure.
Because it's so expansive. But I'm going to give it some thought. I think it's a great idea. Definitely. Yeah.
Send me the first draft, and I'll be your fresh eyes too. It'll be a 5-year project.
By the way, I've heard you speak many times, especially on Rachel Maddow, and I've enjoyed every appearance.
Thank you.
But I think you used a term a while ago, embracing paradoxes.
Yes.
The value of embracing paradoxes, and that's the last thing I was going to say about the Lindbergh-Harry Guggenheim relationship. I think Harry in some way embraced a certain paradox about that relationship in order for it to continue.
So let me finish up here by just saying, we've been talking with Dirk Smillie, The Business of Tomorrow, really good book. If you're interested in American history, art history, business history, good piece of nonfiction writing, this is the book for you. It's very accessible. I wanted to congratulate you on both the writing, which is terrific, but also just somehow you've taken a subject that, looks like something they would study in business school, but actually it reads more like a novel. It's really good.
Wow. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you. And so last question, what do you earn your living as a writer at this moment? Are you living off future book advances? Are you writing for Forbes? What's going on this afternoon?
Well, I have a page at Forbes, which I occasionally write for. But that is not a going career. I'm just a contributor there now. I have a couple of other subjects that I'm thinking about in terms of book length treatment. I did get some news recently from a publisher in China who is going to be producing this book later this year, paperback version, audio, and an ebook as well. So there does seem to be some interest in aviation history in China and some of these other subjects you mentioned that are in the book.
Well, and they have a, I'm being sarcastic, they have a slight interest in wealth and wealth management. The Chinese are known to make some money once in a while these days.
This is true.
Yeah, so now that's great. Did the Falwell book get any kind of international play, or was it pretty much a US market?
It did get some, the sales were pretty good in Europe, strangely enough.
Oh, I believe that. The Europeans are always interviewing me about the religious right. They
Really?
love this stuff. Yeah, because
Yeah.
sort of in their eyes, it's further confirmation, like our gun culture, of just how crazy we are.
Yeah. Well, that explains it then. I think as far as Guggenheim in China goes, by the way, I think there is a certain appetite for American authenticity in terms of brands and stories and characters. So I think that's another driver of overseas interest in books like these.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, and I do urge people to read the book. I'm right now on, get my reading glasses. I am on page 226, and at the top of the, I'm right into the Frank Lloyd Wright thing and all the rest of this on the museum.
Oh, yeah. That's
So
a juicy chapter. Yeah.
I'm about halfway through. So the nice thing is I enjoy the parts of your book most that overlap a little bit of things that I already know something about, like anybody else, and have some connection to. And of course, when you get into the art museums, that's kind of me and what I'm interested in. Okay, so this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, my podcast on Facebook Live. It'll be out as a podcast where podcasts are found. I'm the author most recently of Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, which is in bookstores everywhere, as they say, which today means it's on Amazon and whatever. I've had a wonderful talk here with Dirk, and I wish you the best. And please stay in touch, because I'm really interested in what your next project will be. I mean, you have an incredible mind to be able to produce a book with this much history in it, as well as just biographical content. So, you know, Forbes are lucky to have you. I'm looking forward to your next book.
Thank you so much, Frank. And I will definitely be in touch.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a real pleasure. Stay in touch. Bye.
Might as well. Take care.